your fantasy playoffs are quickly approaching, so right now is the time to improve your team with some trades. And in this video, we'll talk about the 5 running backs you should be targeting in the trade market, not now, but right now. And I want to start by discussing the Tampa Bay Bucks rookie running back, the 4th round pick out of Oregon, Bucky Irving, because this guy kind of had like a hectic week. The week started off with Bucky Irving popping up on the injury report with a toe injury, and it did not look good. If you scroll through here to each day, he ended up not practicing on Wednesday, not practicing on Thursday. And after that Thursday missed practice, we got news that, yeah, this guy's trending to miss unless he makes some miraculous recovery. But then all of a sudden, he does make that miraculous recovery. He practices on Friday in limited fashion, and then we get reports about 24 hours later that the guy is trending to play on Sunday. So as a manager of Bucky Irving, what are you supposed to do with this? Is he even going to be fully healthy? And then you factor in that this backfield was using 3 running backs just a week prior, so a lot of people probably sat Bucky Irving, and that ended up being a mistake. Because the guy went out there in week 8, and he played 42% of the snaps, more than he saw in week 7. He saw about half of the rushing attempts, 45% according to Fantasy Life. And Bucky Irving in this game, yes, Rachaad White fumbled early, so maybe that led to a little bit more touches for Irving, but he looked rather healthy because he went on to do this right here. He had 16 total touches, 9 rushes, and a massive 7 receptions for the running back. Really, for anybody's great, but for the running back position, that totals 84 total yards in this game, which means he's going on yet again and averaging like 5 yards per touch or so. And the 7 receptions is key because this was the first game without Chris Godwin, who's done for the year, and Mike Evans, who's done for at least another 2 to 3 weeks. And the Bucks clearly leaned on their tight end, K. Dotton, and then their running backs to move the ball in the passing game. Because both Rachaad White and Bucky Irving in this game, they ended up combining. They combined it in this one for 12 receptions between the two of them. So at least for 1 week in week 8, and I think this will be the case moving forward, it was these guys, those running backs were the answer to who is going to replace Chris Godwin. And yes, moving forward, maybe we see some more usage out of Jalen McMillan, the rookie who's had 15 targets the last 2 weeks, but this is not a guy that I expect to play the Chris Godwin role, and he did not play it this week. It was Sterling Shepard who played it for about 3 quarters. He injured his hamstring in the 3rd quarter and then was in and out of the game. But for the most part, there's no replacement for Chris Godwin on this team, and Mike Evans won't be back for a few more weeks, so it's going to be the running backs that continue to get check down targets. So that's very important, and that's great news for Bucky Irving, who all season long has looked like by far the best running back on this team. But the other thing here is Sean Tucker. Sean Tucker, who's coming into his 2nd season, an undrafted player out of Syracuse. He looked great the last couple of weekends, and he was starting to split the backfield more. We saw Sean Tucker just a week ago in week 7 play about 20% of the snaps and see enough touches to kind of make this whole backfield a mess. And you can see that usage right here in week 7, 20% of the snaps, about 20% of the carries. Like, that's bad if you're just going to be the 3rd running back. Like, if there's only 2 running backs and one of them seeing 19%, okay, no big deal. But that guy seeing 19% as the 3rd running back is a concern. But in week 8, you could see right here, just 10% of the snaps, only 10% of the rush attempts. His usage overall went down, and that allowed both Rachaad White, but also Bucky Irving to see a lot more upside. So now through 8 weeks, you're getting an explosive running back in Bucky Irving as a 4th round rookie who's already commanding a ton of opportunities in this offense, and it should only get better. I mean, as of right now, he's been fantastic. He's averaging 5.9 yards per touch. Every time the guy touches the ball, he's averaging 6 yards this year. He ranks top 10 in broken tackle rate according to Player Profiler, and scroll over here to his breakaway runs of 10 plus yards. He's also top 10 in that category. And again, this is a guy who's not seeing the majority of his backfield touches. If that starts to happen at some point, if Rachaad White misses more time, or they just say, hey, you're too good, Bucky Irving, to not give you 15 touches a game, well, then it's wheels up. And if you look at his upcoming schedule, like, yes, next week against the Kansas City Chiefs, it's not going to be great. But again, his pass catching role, 7 receptions on 7 targets this past week, can allow him to escape that. Then it's a fine matchup against the 49ers at home, and then things get really exciting. You get the Giants, the Panthers, and the Raiders. 3 bottom 10 run defenses, and then you go to your fantasy postseason, and you get the Cowboys and Panthers again, 2 bottom 10 run defenses. So he'll face 5 bottom 10 run defenses the rest of the season in fantasy. I want to be trading for Bucky Irving right now. And I also think you should be trading for Ramondre Stevenson. Look, I considered Ramondre Stevenson a buy low last week after he had an abysmal performance in London. You remember that game? He ends up having 9 touches, 25 total yards. This was a game that he came into it injured. He didn't practice all week and then had to go fly to London. And I was the one on here throwing him some bail, saying, listen, this guy had to fly to London with an injury. You think that's great to sit on a plane for that long with an injury? To then adjust to the 6 to 7 hour time difference when your body's not already healthy and now it's definitely not going to be right? So we came out here and said you should buy low on Ramondre Stevenson, because before that game, in 3 out of 6 games, he ended up going for a top 12 finish in fantasy. And now he was a buy low option because we were believing in what we were seeing out of Drake May, the rookie quarterback, through 2 of his starts, believing that that would propel the offense forward. And hopefully you were able to buy low on Ramondre Stevenson, because his role in week 8 hit probably the best point it has all season long, at least since like week 1 or week 2. He saw 23 touches in this game. Now he only totaled 65 yards, but he finds the end zone twice and he gets you 23.5 fantasy points. Couple things here. If we scroll through on Player Profiler to the game logs now for Ramondre Stevenson, week 1 running back 7, week 2 running back 12. You get here in week 5, he was the running back 4, and now in week 8, we just showed you that he was once again a top 12 running back. So that's 4 top 10 finishes or top 12 RB1 finishes in fantasy in 8 games. And 2 of those games, he was banged up. And now here's the exciting part according to Fantasy Life. He played 79% of the snaps in this game, a season high, which indicates that he's finally healthy. He saw 74% of the overall team carries in this one. Again, indicates that he's healthy. But more important to me, he ended up running 20 routes compared to just 5 for Antonio Gibson. And that was never the case in past weeks. It was always Gibson getting a lot more passing game usage. Look, this is the type of usage you were getting out of Ramondre Stevenson the first 2 weeks of the season. See right here, his routes run, he was getting the 20 routes, he was getting 17 routes, he was actually seeing targets, 3 targets, 5 targets. He was operating as a workhorse back, and what did that translate to? A running back 7, a running back 12 finish, and that was with the worst quarterback. I believe there's a better quarterback now in Drake May, and yes, Drake May suffered a concussion. He might miss 1 game, but it shouldn't be a long-term thing. But since week 1 and week 2, Ramondre had been banged up, and what you saw was Antonio Gibson start to run more routes, start to see more usage in the 2-minute offense, and this started to make it even Jermichael Hasty at times. It started to make it a situation like, okay, if Ramondre Stevenson isn't fully healthy, or if he's losing the passing game work in an offense where they're not scoring touchdowns often, well, what is he for fantasy? And that is definitely a concern, but now it seems like he's healthy and those concerns are gone. It seemed like he wasn't getting that usage maybe due to his health, or maybe they just changed the game script because that's what people do. They change the roles on offense, because this past week, 3 targets, 3 catches. Now it's only about 4.7 fantasy points, but he gets those 4.7 fantasy points, which matters in weeks where he's not scoring multiple touchdowns, and he's also staying on the field in those 2-minute offense situations, which leads to more carries and potential touchdowns. Now, as I mentioned, Drake May did get a concussion, mostly common. He would miss week 9 is what you're seeing right here from SportsMD analysis. Again, it's different for everybody. So he's expecting a return right now for week 10 for Drake May, and that's kind of what I would expect at this point. So if we look ahead to the schedule, that means that they might not have their quarterback for a matchup against the Titans, which is a tough matchup. And then you look ahead and you get a matchup against the Bears. Like, these are 2 bad matchups for Ramondre, but Ramondre in his career as an underdog has been really good because of his passing game role. And it seems like it's back now. In his career as an underdog, he averages over 15 fantasy points per game. And then after that, heading into the fantasy postseason is where the schedule really opens up. Matchup against the Rams, bottom 10 run defense. The Colts at home, bottom 10 run defense. Cardinals, bottom 10 run defense. And the Bills, bottom 10 run defense. That's going into and then in the fantasy playoffs. I think Ramondre, obviously coming off of a bigger game, not going to be able to buy low like you could have last week, but I do think he's still worth targeting in some sort of packages. Now, in terms of the types of players you should target in trades for guys like Bucky Irving and Ramondre Stevenson, that's where I have my rest of season trade tool right here. It's my top 150 rankings. This is last week's version. The next version will be sent out on Tuesday, depending on when you're watching this. It could already be out to about 21,000 other people, and it's simple. You just use that tool to identify types of players you should be trading for and or multiple players in a package deal. And you can get access to that with my fantasy blueprint. Again, over 20,000 other people currently have access to it. It's very simple to acquire and use. You just click the link in the description below and it'll take you to this page where it says how to get access. You follow these 2 simple steps. You click the get access button and you come to this page where you can sign up through one of my 2 partners to get your fantasy blueprint. And the reason why I want you to sign up through one of my 2 partners is because when you do, for you, it becomes risk-free through those 2 partners, meaning it's a one-time payment of just $10 for the entire season. You get tools sent to you every single day during the season. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, just reach out and you get your $10 right back. If you want to join the 20,000 plus other people using my tools that I use in all of my leagues, you can scan the QR code on the screen right here or click the link in the description below. All right, go get those tools, smack around your league mates with, and then consider trading for Javon Williams. And Javon Williams is somebody last week that we discussed as a hold. We said he's a hold, not somebody you should sell high on. I think what you're seeing right now from Javon is legit. And now after a down week, he's a buy low. Because look, we're just a week removed from week 7. We're on Thursday Night Football against the Saints, who have a terrible run defense. They look like they gave up in the second half. He got 17 touches in that game, goes for over 100 total yards and 2 touchdowns. So this was the best game of Javonte's career. It was the first game he ever had multiple touchdowns in a game in his entire career. He's trending up. He's finally over that knee injury from a few years back now, a year and a half or so ago, that really has limited him and definitely did last year. And heading into week 8, his last 4 games, he was averaging 16.5 opportunities per game and a 17% target share, which is an elite number for a running back. Top 3 in the NFL or around there. And everything was trending in the right direction because in week 8, he was facing the Panthers, who were the worst run defense, allowing the most rushing yards per game, but it just didn't work out for him. Like, the usage was there once again for Javonte, 17 carries, 4 receptions, continued to see a high target share, 16% in this game. So 21 total touches, but he only gets 44 rushing yards. Only gets 8 receiving yards on 4 receptions. That's all we got, and he failed to crack 10 fantasy points or find the end zone against the Panthers. I mean, it was just a disappointing day for him overall. He wasn't efficient in this game, but the good news was he saw 20 plus touches again. And now if we pull up Fantasy Life over the last 5 games for Javon Williams, let's look at this sample down here. He's averaging right now 13.2 carries per game and 4.4 targets per game. That's 17.6 opportunities per game during this time, while sporting a 16% target share, which only Breece Hall and Alvin Kamara have seen a higher number during that stretch. And yes, when you look at the box scores, you will see that Jaleel McLaughlin Gelfin, who's often been an efficient running back dating back to last year and definitely his college career, was efficient in this one. 8 carries for 47 yards, averaging 6 yards a carry. Had a 9-yard reception for a touchdown on this one, so he outproduces Javon Williams both on a per touch basis in the fantasy box score and actually finds the end zone. So that's not ideal, but then you pull up what his actual numbers were in this game, just 32% of the snaps, just 26% of the rush attempts, and I don't think they're going to increase that. He doesn't have the type of body to be a workhorse running back in the NFL. He's exactly what he was this past week. Somebody who could earn up to 8 to 10 touches in a game, but most weeks he'll probably hover around 5 to 6 to 7, and Javonte will be the workhorse. And what do we know about this Broncos offense? They're not an offense unless they're forced to that wants to throw the ball 40 times with Bo Nix. No, they want to use Bo Nix's legs, and they want to rely on their running game, and their offensive line has been decent enough to do that this year. Now, the upcoming matchups against the Ravens and the Chiefs are brutal. I will not try and say otherwise, but let's just scroll a little bit, because then you get the Raiders, a bottom 5 run defense. You get a fine matchup at home against the Browns defensive line that's been banged up, and you can run on them. Then you get a nice matchup against the Colts and the Bengals heading into and in the fantasy playoffs. Like, yes, there'll be a couple of tough matchups along the way, but in the fantasy postseason and getting there, it opens up a lot more for Javonte. All right, now this next guy, I can't believe we're talking about this, but it's happening right now. I think it is at least. David Montgomery is in a buy low window for like the first time in 2 years in fantasy. Like, outside of when he got injured early on in 2023, since then he has been a solid player, and so far this year he's been solid, but the last 2 weeks are opening up a buy low window. Because in week 7, David Montgomery scored just 9 points. He only had 12 touches, 31 rushing yards, 39 receiving yards. Like, 70 total yards here is pretty good for 12 touches. Like, that's 6 yards per touch. But the problem in this game was he ended up, 1, having a tough matchup against the Vikings on the road, and 2, injuring his ankle early on. He missed a couple of drives, and I'm sure that affected him the rest of the game. But what's even more damning is that these last 2 weeks, his backfield running mate, the first early second round pick in fantasy drafts this summer, Jahmyr Gibbs, who's been fantastic his first 2 years in the NFL, well, in week 7, when David Montgomery got banged up a little bit, Jahmyr Gibbs popped off and was the running back 1 on the week in that same difficult matchup, putting up 35 fantasy points, totaling 116 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. He ended up catching 4 balls for 44 yards, so a massive performance for Jahmyr Gibbs, and that opened up somewhat of a buy low window for David Montgomery, but this past week maybe really would have pushed it all the way open. Because Montgomery came out and he actually led the backfield with 47% of the snaps, 38% of the rush attempts. Now, what did this lead to? 15 fantasy points. Overall, though, just 9 carries for 33 yards. He scores a touchdown, has 1 catch for 5 yards, and he actually threw a touchdown in this game. But in general, they had a punt return touchdown in this one. It was all wonky all over the place in terms of the Lions getting up big and then pulling their starters at the end of the third quarter. But once again, Jahmyr Gibbs was outshining David Montgomery here. Just on 11 carries, had 127 yards, had the long touchdown run, caught a ball as well, 23 fantasy points, was once again a top 10 running back. And now this is maybe leading to the question that obviously Jahmyr Gibbs is the superior talent. That's why he was a second round pick. But David Montgomery has just been average to bad for fantasy at least the last 2 games. But again, this needs more context because in week 7, it was the ankle injury and a tough matchup that surely limited him. This past week, it was a blowout where he only played 1 drive in the second half. 1 drive because the starters got pulled at the end of the third quarter. He had his drive, then Gibbs had a drive, and then they were getting pulled. Like, he played basically 1 half of football and got you 15 points. Not bad in my opinion to get 10 touches and 40 yards and a touchdown and basically 1 half of football and then a passing touchdown as well. And again, I don't think he's going to be cheap. David Montgomery, people aren't giving up on him. He had so many touchdowns for like 8 weeks in a row dating back to last season earlier this year. No one's giving up on him in this great Lions offense, but I do think his price tag has dropped a little bit, and now maybe you can get a package deal together for him. Because his rest of season schedule, I mean, it's fantastic. Multiple matchups against the Packers bottom 10 run defense. The Texans have a good pass rush, but not as good of a defensive line when it comes to stopping the run. The Jaguars at home, that should be a game where they're 10 plus point favorites and playing from ahead. The Colts is a defense you can run on. Like, you just keep scrolling here. The Bills at home in the fantasy postseason, that is a dream matchup. I don't really see many bad matchups. Sure, maybe 1 or 2 matchups against the Bears in there, but I feel really good about the Lions offensive line in any matchup. So if you can, try and trade for David Montgomery, and then this next guy I think is becoming more appealing by the week. And that's Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals, who it seems like every week I come on here and say, yeah, another week has passed and another strong usage week for Chase Brown, because this past week, although the snap count is at 48%, and that's mostly due to the game script, this is the important part. 67% of the rush attempts in this backfield was a season high when he's playing with Zach Moss. So he looks like the clear RB1. He turns that into 14 total touches, just 34 yards, finds the end zone, so he gets you 11.5 fantasy points. Nothing too great overall here, but a tougher matchup against Philly's defensive line. And also you have to factor in that they got down by multiple scores in this game, Cincinnati. So when you're getting down by multiple scores, it's going to be tough to run the ball. And what we know and what we've talked about in past weeks is that Zach Moss has been the guy who has been the passing down back, the 2-minute offense, the third down and long. And when you're trailing by 2 to 3 scores against Philadelphia, Zach Moss is going to come on the field more because it's passing down situations. You're operating in the 2 to 4 minute offense for most of the second half in that situation. So that explains why Chase Brown's snaps are only 48% and not 55 to 60% like they were in past weeks. And it also explains why Zach Moss goes to 42% of the snaps, 48% of the routes run. I mean, you can scroll over. You'll get him seeing to 100% of the 2-minute offense snaps, 78% of the long down and distance according to Fantasy Life. But then we just go back here, and this is the stuff that really matters, because in neutral to positive game scripts, which the Bengals should be in a lot of this year, they have a good offense, 28% of the rush attempts for Zach Moss. This is what we're looking at in this backfield right now. It is Chase Brown who is the lead back on early downs, and maybe, just maybe, can actually earn some third down passing usage along the way. But right now, he's the lead back, seeing like 60 to 70% of the carries. And when they're not in a game script like this, where they're losing by 20 points in a difficult matchup against the Eagles defensive line, yes, you're going to get Chase Brown having blow up weeks, and I think it could happen as soon as this upcoming week, because they're 7.5 point favorites at home against the Raiders, who allow top 5 yards per play rushing. It's an awesome matchup for Chase Brown. I'm expecting a massive bounce back week, and I think he's somebody that you should continue to buy right now if you can in your fantasy leagues. The matchup is perfect. Right now is the time to get him. Now, this next guy is quietly seeing like one of the best workloads in football, but nobody seems to care. But before we get there, over 60% of you are not subscribed to this channel. We're in the thick of the fantasy season. Fantasy postseason coming up right now. So here is the gentleman's agreement. We shake on it. You find this video helpful or entertaining, just hit the subscribe button. These videos take me about 6 to 8 hours, from research to editing to recording to uploading, to get out to you beautiful people. All you have to do in return is hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel a ton. Now that brings me to the guy I was talking about, who's seeing one of the best roles in football, especially lately, but nobody seems to care, and that is Tony Pollard. Because look at this on the season right now. Tony Pollard, according to Player Profiler, he's averaging 15.7 carries per game, 4.2 targets per game. That's 20 opportunities per game, which ranks top 10 in the NFL. And his strong usage only continued in week 8. It actually hit like season highs, because Pollard came out here and played 80% of the snaps, something like only 5 running backs, if that, in the NFL are doing right now. And he saw 69% of his backfield's rush attempts, 69% of the routes run. I mean, this is RB1 usage across the board in all situations, something that I could count probably on one hand the role that other running backs in the league are seeing like this. And it led to, strong usage is going to lead to some strong fantasy weeks, if not a lot. 23 total touches, 94 rushing yards, 23 receiving, so 117 total yards. He gets you 15.7 fantasy points, which is not like a blow-up week, but here's the thing. He was facing the Lions on the road. His team lost by 40 points in this game, so yeah, this was worst-case scenario for you, and because of his strong role, Tony Pollard still goes out there and gets you 15 points, still goes out there and has 117 total yards because of these 23 total touches. Even in a difficult matchup, it's starting to make him matchup proof. And not only was he in a difficult matchup, trailing the whole game, losing by 40, but he had Mason Rudolph as his quarterback. Like, it was legitimately worst case scenario. Now, I will say that Tajay Spears was out this past week yet again with a hamstring. He's not practicing. It's not guaranteed that he even returns in week 9, although maybe there's a chance that he does. So over these last 2 games without Tajay Spears, you're getting Pollard, according to Fantasy Life, seeing 85% of the snaps, about 70% of the rush attempts right here, 70% of the routes run. Now, that's a great role. Of course, if Tajay Spears returns, that'll probably drop down a little bit, but even when Tajay was active this year, Pollard was still playing 67% of the snaps and handling nearly 70% of the backfield carries. His role is fantastic. And it should only get better in matchups where his offense sustained drives, which might seem crazy, but this upcoming week, they're actually in a spot where they should win a game, being a neutral to positive game script against the Patriots. And then you're going to scroll and see some tough matchups. You're going to see a matchup against the Vikings in here, a matchup against the Chargers in here, but then you scroll to the fantasy postseason, and that's what I care most about. The Commanders are here, the Jaguars, the Bengals, the Colts. You get Jaguars again. Like, these are all amazing matchups that are going to take you into and throughout the fantasy postseason. I think none of those teams are top half of the league run defense. And in a lot of those matchups, like against the Colts, like against the Jaguars, it should be close games where it's not a blowout script. All right, the next guy I want to talk about, you're going to have to pay some money for it. And it's DeAndre Swift, who early in the season, like most people, I was saying like, yeah, this guy's been terrible. He's awful. He's absolutely not somebody you want on your team. But things have changed the past month, because even in a game that was very disappointing for the Bears offense coming out of the bye, which is even more disappointing because you had another week to prepare, everybody stunk basically in fantasy except Swift. And heading into this matchup, according to Fantasy Life, let's just scroll right here and see the production. You're getting, these are his fantasy points, number 2 overall, number 3, number 2, and number 6. So 3 top 6 finishes. He goes for 165 total yards, 120, 119, scoring a touchdown in each of those games, going into his bye week, and now coming out in a nice matchup in week 8 against the Commanders run defense that's allowing the 6th most yards per play rushing. So that's fantastic. And all of a sudden, the guy DeAndre Swift, who was one of the worst running backs in the first month of the season, the past month of the season, he's been great. He's all the way up to the running back 16 in fantasy. Over the last 4 weeks, he's been a top 3 running back in fantasy. And after his week 8 showing, he's the number 1 running back the past 5 weeks in points per game. Because in week 8, despite his offense struggling on the road against Washington, he goes for 18 carries, 129 yards, a touchdown. Should have had another touchdown in this game. They handed it off to an offensive lineman who ended up fumbling the ball. They gave another touchdown to Roschon Johnson on the 1-yard line. So Swift could have had an even bigger day here, but still has 22 fantasy points, which means now for 4 straight games, he's gone for at least 110 total yards. He's gone for at least 20 fantasy points, and he's been a top 10 running back in 4 straight games. And honestly, it should only continue this upcoming coming week because it's a coin flip game against the Cardinals. They're on the road. The Bears, they're 1-point underdogs, but the Cardinals have a bottom 10 right now run defense. It's a nice matchup for Swift, who even in spots where he won't have good matchups on the ground, if you look at his schedule right now, he does have matchups coming up against his division rival, the Bears and the Vikings, which are tough spots. We know he has the passing game role to keep it going, and then you scroll down to his fantasy postseason, and you do get some more beneficial spots against the Seahawks and the Packers, depending on when your fantasy playoffs are, which I would say are very plus matchups for running backs this year. Either way, you're going to have to pay for him. This is not like a one-for-one thing. Maybe you trade a wide receiver one-for-one, but probably a package deal to where you can get Swift on your team. If you have to improve your overall roster, trade away like a big name running back, Swift plus somebody else could work. So these have been the running backs you should trade for before week 9 begins. And if you want to see the wide receivers you should trade for, check out this video once it's out on Wednesday. And then the waiver ads for this week, if you want to still check, even if your waivers have run, these guys might still be on your waiver wire, you can check out that video right there.